Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I, Vincent, your summary was a really good introduction. Even though the Pennebaker name was not a giant node there, it's probably because I'm not really a deception researcher primarily. As many of you might know, I'm a social psychologist by training, but over much of my career, I've dipped into all these different fields. And one of those fields that I'm now close to is the world of computer science, but which is also an area where there's some fascinating work being done on deception. But when I think of deception, I think of it a, a lot more often more broadly, as opposed to it more in the interrogation kind of level or the kind of one-on-one. I'm also interested in some of these broader issues, such as fake news or the idea of two people who have very different worldviews. They might agree on the facts of them, but they have such different interpretations of the facts that the two sides accuse the other of being just lying, deceptive bastards. And this is, of course, to me, just the joy of being in psychology, trying to understand how different people think and approach things. So what I'd like to do today is talk very briefly about kind of the broad perspectives that I take in terms of the analysis of language, and then jump into some interesting findings that I have amassed over the years that I've never actually spoken publicly about. So which makes this practically a publication, because this is going to go on YouTube. The issue that I've been interested in is, what do words tell us about people? In other words, as speaking, what kind of signals am I giving off about my personality, about my motives, my relationship with the audience, the context I'm in, etc. And these kinds of questions are really central to what all of us do. Now, the nature of language is frankly, is a bit of a mess. The problem is that as we think about language, there are all these different types of words that we use. And if you look at the history, certainly of psychology, the early work on the study of language was essentially the study of content analysis, looking at what are the motives or drives or themes that people talked about. And what happened was researchers going back to McClellan, hell, even going back to Freud, was looking at which topics do you bring up? And to what degree are you talking about, let's say, affiliation or power or achievement or other general interesting themes? And the way that they would do this is they would get a group of words that they would be looking at or phrases. They would rate them all, and you could look at any given text and stand back and say, well, this person is talking a lot about achievement versus affiliation or whatever. I got into this in a backwards way, which has been pretty much the history of my career. And this one was, I started off looking at expressive writing, that if people wrote about upsetting traumatic experiences in their lives, their health improved. And I became interested in, can I tell the difference between people who benefited from this writing versus who didn't by looking at what they about? And I found that human judges were terrible at this. They didn't agree. And I searched for a computer program that could analyze text. And at the time, I didn't find one. Years later, ironically, years later, I discovered that there'd been a big project in the 60s done by Phil Stone and his colleagues at Harvard, working with the General Inquirer. But that work had never moved beyond a mainframe computer. And I just completely had missed it. In any case, the work that we did was working with one of my students, Martha Francis. We developed this computer program called Luke, Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. And basically, it was the heart of it were a series of dictionaries. And the way we started off is the way everybody else starts off, which was looking at emotions. So there'd be an anger dictionary, which is a group of words that are related to anger, a sadness one, an anxiety one, a happy one, et cetera, et cetera. And then we added some other dictionaries that were cognitive, words like causal words, et cetera. And as long as we were doing it, we threw in parts of speech because you didn't need judges to know about pronouns, prepositions, articles, etc. The computer program would go into any given text and calculate the percentage of words that were along each of these dimensions. And the first version of the program had maybe 50 dimensions of language. And we've just finished the most recent version of Luke. And this is going to sound like an advertisement. It's called Luke 22, is the most recent version. It probably has 110 different dimensions, but it also does everything. So if you need to have your paper written, you can just push the button. It'll write up the paper and submit it to the journal that the computer thinks is most appropriate. That actually is deception. I don't know if you picked that up with your various methods. In any case, a pretty slick program. Now, the fundamental difference that I stumbled across early on with all of this, once I started playing with it, was the distinction between content words and function words. Content words are words that convey content. They're nouns, regular verbs, some or most adjectives, and most, but not all, verbs. These are words that are the essence of information that I'm conveying. So in that last sentence, the content words would be information. Those are heavy content words. Most of the other words that I am conveying are function words. These are the words that we don't hear. These include you, he, she, it, prepositions, to, of, for, articles, a, and the, and, or, etc. And I say I'm about to, maybe, there we go. Negations, no, not, never. A certain group of adverbs that are non-referential, really, very, so, and a couple of others. What's interesting in English is there's really only about 200 common function words. Nevertheless, they account for between 55% of all words we read, we hear, we say. In other words, these are the most common words, but they're words that are processed in the brain differently. They tend to be processed differentially in Broca's area, which is linked to the frontal lobe, as opposed to most of the content words, which are differentially processed at higher rates in Wernicke's area, the temporal lobe. Now, what's intriguing about this is that these function words are social. Our ability to use them requires social skills. So, for example, you find a note outside the building that you're in, and it's on the ground, and it says, I'm not here, I'll be right back. Now, on one level, the note makes perfect sense. On another level, it makes no sense at all, because who is this? Who's I? Am not. Am is present tense. When was it written? Not here. Was the note always? Where did it come from? In other words, all of those are function words. They only have meaning between the writer and the presumed audience of it. And that note only has meaning in a particular location at a particular time. In other words, all of them are all contextual, but they are so much more than this person's intention to meet somebody at this location. By reading this and analyzing it, we also get a sense, a little bit of a sense of who this person is. First of all, we know that this person knows the other intended person. I'll be right back. It's also telling us that this person is, we can get a sense that the person is probably more informal. They are, and we can make some other educated guesses that we would do better than chance at. So I became intrigued with these because I had stumbled across the fact that men and women, when I first became interested in this, I was downloading all of these chats that were online. Back then, for those of you of a certain age, you will remember America Online, AOL, the most unbelievable system that came into people's homes all over the world. And I would download these chats at night, and the next morning I would go and analyze them. And some were chats from women, some from men. And the first thing I did was to compare the differences between men and women. And I discovered they use these function words at really different rates. And they didn't, at the beginning, didn't make any sense. The first one were I words, I, me, and my. I went on the assumption that men would use I words more because, let's be honest, men are more self-important, you know, obnoxious, narcissistic. But women used I words at much higher rates than men. And I found this in the years afterwards in study after study after study across languages, across cultures. Why is that? Well, there were some other things. We found that I words are used more when people are self-conscious, when they are being open and um, disclosing. And they also are more prone among people who are depressed, lower status, etc. And what I words we discovered meant they reflected self-reflection, self-focus. That so if, for example, you are physically sick, you will use I words more in your writing and your speaking than when you're not sick. Why? Because your body is pulling your attention inward. If a bunch of people are staring at you, you will use I words more because your attention is being focused inward. In other words, these function words are reflecting psychological states, articles and prepositions. Who uses that more, men or women? It turns out men use articles and prepositions at higher rates. Why in the world is that? Well, that's because articles and prepositions tend to be used more for nouns, for objects and things. And in general, across our various texts that we measure, males are more likely to talk about objects and things. Now, this is, obviously, in some contexts, everybody, men and women use articles and prepositions at higher rates than others. But within context, there is this interesting sex differences. Social words, he, she, they, words such as that. Women use those more than men do. Women are generally more interested in other human beings compared. And there's one other one that I've become particularly interested in are cognitive words. These cognitive words are words like understand, realize, know, because, cause, effect, reason, rationale, etc. And across the board, women use those words at higher rates than men. And one reason is that women, it's depending on who you're talking about, whereas men talk more about objects and things, women tend to talk about other human beings. And other human beings are far, far more complex than our objects and things. When you're trying to understand why person A did this to person B, my God, the theories that we have to bring forward are really, really complex. When you're asking, why does the battery not start? The causal model behind that is a pretty bare bones one. Now, all of this starts to become interesting when we start tying this to psychological issues. And obviously one that we're in this room, we're interested in is kind of the nature of deception. When individuals are telling the truth versus lying, is there a general shift in the way people use language? Now, it's important for you to understand that my approach is looking at an entire text, and the text be a story, it could be um, anything. And so looking in and we're calculating the percentage of words within that given text. So in an interesting way, the text is the context. And in multiple lab studies, years ago, we did a study where we had people come in, and it was, the typical parlor game kind of deception project where you get people to lie or tell the truth. You have judges try to judge if they're lying or telling the truth, which they obviously don't. But the reality is what we found was the small words did a pretty good job at distinguishing deception from non-deception. And the best predictor was the use of first person singular, I, me, my, words such as that. That when people were telling the truth, they tend to use I words more than when they were being deceptive. And there were some other dimensions that were related as well, but they were much weaker. One was, which we're now calling differentiation words. These were words such as without, except, but, not, etc. These are interesting words because they're making this distinction between what is in a category and what's not in a category. And so when you're telling the truth, you use more of those words because you're able to answer questions in a more complex way. So if I'm lying about a story and I'm asked about what I did, it's easy for me to make up something that I could have been doing at the time, but it's really hard to say what I wasn't doing since I didn't do any of it. So you're thinking, it's hard for you to say, well, yesterday I went to the store. No, really, I wasn't at the bank. Or to say that there was some exception to that story. In any case, what I was fascinated that this was related to deception, but there was another thing that interested me as well, and that is people, the higher the status that people are, the less they use words as what I as well. Position, they use I words less. Deceptive? Probably. I know when I became a department chair, I had to control myself a little bit and not be quite as open and honest because it had implications. Was I deceptive? Yeah, I'd prefer not to say that, but yes. Uh, what if I want to go beat somebody up? I'm not a typical aggressive person, but you can see a little bit like being a leader. If I'm going to act aggressively, I would be a lot more likely to um, withhold my thoughts and feelings because I don't want to give signal to you that I want to be aggressive towards you. Now, I came to this world of aggression in a, a backwards way. Uh, one of them was I was doing some work with one of U.S. government agencies, and I actually published this study. But looking at the missives that various terrorist organizations gave in the weeks and months prior to blowing something up or killing people or doing terrorist acts. These, and you all know the various groups. This would be Al Qaeda, the various Al Qaeda groups, and some of the others. And one of the best predictors of they're about to do something nefarious is they stop communicating. In other words, they are trying to psychologically distance themselves. They don't want you to think about them. In other words, they are becoming, if you like, less personal. And I was really fascinated by that phenomenon. And we also know in some of the deception studies we've done and other people as well, when people are lying, they don't say as much. And again, kind of this psychological distancing. I came across, I'd done all this work on language, and a woman who was an English major at a small college wrote me an email saying, listen, I don't know if there's anything to this, but this was after the Boston bombing. She had been able to download all the tweets of the bomber who had, one of them was the younger brother who had sent out lots of tweets over the previous year. She said, there is this big drop in this guy's use of I words. And this woman was Brittany Norman. And we did a paper. By the way, I forgot to show you all my PowerPoint slides. So let me go ahead and start these. Okay, ooh, looks good. So that's Brittany Norman was the student who was part of this. And what we did was we went through. Oops, I'll start with this one. What she did was to go through and analyze this person's use of I. Now, in daily conversation, I words are between 7 and 8% of all words. And Twitter, the level before here similar. And what happened was the bombing, hold on one second here. The bombing occurred around here about the same day as the last tweet. But one thing you'll see is that here this bomber is talking at the same rate all the time, and then all of a sudden the level of I words drops to that's a large significant drop in language, which to me signaled some kind of deception. That what I think happened was that there was a major decision that was made at this time by he and his brother, and it was at this point that he decided to join his brother. And what was interesting, if you read these tweets, you don't pick up anything. And he continues talking in the same kind of vapid way that a teenager would use language. Now, one thing that informed me about this was analyzing George Bush. Now you'll remember that George Bush, after 9/11, was looking to blame somebody, and so Saddam Hussein was somebody who he had always been annoyed with, and he built this completely we now know partially fabricated worldview that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. But our question is, when did George Bush decide to attack? And what happened was, I had been analyzing Bush's press conferences for years, and Bush had press conferences almost twice a week. So if you look here on the left, you will see what happened to George Bush. So this is the rate at which in his press conferences he used I words. And when 9/11 occurred, there was a big drop. And then he gradually came up. And then in August, these numbers below aren't very helpful, but this was August, the year before the war. You see this giant drop in I words from about 4.2% down to about 2.5%. And they stayed at that really low level until the war started, which was at this last blue line. What's intriguing about this was, in the years afterwards, it came out that it was at this point that he decided to go to war. And so we know that between the press conferences just before and the press conference just after was the time when there was that decision. In other words, when he was making this decision and he made it finally and started to put the apparatus in mind, he starts holding back. He's holding his cards tighter to his vest. And in fact, if you're a leader, that's kind of what you want. You want, if it's your leader, you don't want them spilling the beans. Now, Putin is another interesting one. Now, Putin doesn't give lots of press conferences. I will say he's one interesting guy, and you can see he's not a very personable guy. His rates of first-person singular are very low. These are his yearly press conferences that he generally gives in December. I was asked to give a talk at the end of December, early January, and I thought, I'll look at Putin's words and see if there's any sign that he's going to go into Ukraine. And that was when this was here, and I told the interviewer, I don't see any evidence that this is going to go into Ukraine. And then as it got closer and closer, he went into Ukraine right after this press conference here. I went back and analyzed his data, and he showed the same thing we'd seen with George Bush in terms of drops. That is, I don't think he made his final decision until this late December to go into Ukraine. But once he did, you could see those differences. So these are some of the things that I'm quite interested in. I'm going to stop my PowerPoint presentation right now. And let me just give you a couple of websites. For the first one, to make your life easier, you can just Google my name. The second one is the new version of Luke. It's called Luke 22. And if you go to that website, you can see, you go to the help section, you can see some of the manual on the new version. And I think you'll be impressed with the kinds of stuff that it does. Okay, so let me just summarize everything I've said. Looking at these function words can give us a perspective on people and ways of thinking that are really quite interesting. And there are other dimensions of language that I haven't gotten into that if I were going to speak much longer, I would talk to you about in terms of ways that we are getting more deeply into ways people think and ways that they are putting ideas together that gives us even more information psychological state. Let me stop here and open this up for questions in the few minutes we have left. And Sophie, I'll put you in charge of
Yes, thank you very much,
directing
and
some.
thank you very much for this wonderful and insightful presentation.